My lord, it's about time. You know, they announced a Crow movie back in 2008 starring Heath Ledger, like a little bit before The Dark Knight released. Then after he died, rest in peace, they announced another one 2 or 3 years later with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Then that fell through, and then they announced another one a few years after that with some other actor I don't even remember the name of. All in all, we've known about this movie's release for like 16 years. And now finally, they've released one promotional image. And now we get to see exactly, whoa, what the fuck is that? Oh shit! What the fuck is that? He's got a nipple eye on his chest. Well, that is unfortunate. 16 fucking years, and this is the best you can hobble together. Okay, alright. So I'm not going to jump to conclusions here. The movie might be good. But whether the movie is good or not, one thing is for sure. This looks like a piece of shit. And the movie being fucking amazing isn't going to suddenly make this not a piece of shit. That's a terrible look. And I'm not calling that The Crow. This man will be known as Nipple Eye from this point on. So the original plan for this video was to make a comparison between the original The Crow comic as well as the original movie to see which one was done better, in celebration for the release of the new Crow film. But now this has turned into less of a celebration and more of a remembrance of better times. So yeah, let's get this depressing shit started. So I read the original The Crow comic book back in high school in like 10th grade. So what was that, 2009 maybe? And this might be blasphemy to say, but it was okay. It was fine. I just didn't get into it as much as I thought I would. It's not a bad story necessarily, but it's written in this very metaphorical way that I think hinders it from being a truly great comic. So just to explain, the author of The Crow had a real life tragedy. His fiance died by a drunk driver, and in order to work through his grief, he decided to sit down and start writing, which is what he would normally do. And this is the story that he made. And it's essentially all of the feelings that he was going through while going through the grief of his fiancée dying. And everything in the story is a metaphor for how he was feeling at the time. So the story is the exact same in the comic and in the movie. Shelly and Eric get killed. Eric comes back, takes revenge on all the people that killed him and Shelly, says some very flowery, poetic things while he does it, then at the end returns to the grave once his job is completed. I don't have any real issues with the plot. It's a basic revenge story. However, normally a story like this would be filled with characters and villains with different motivations, beliefs, characterizations, things like this. The comic really doesn't have any of that. Eric's not really a character, nor are any of the villains in this story. Funboy has a little bit, like not much, but he's got something. Despite not regretting anything that he's done in his life, he does accept his death and accept the punishment that the Crow is bestowing upon him. And he has an interesting conversation with Eric before his death. Like I said, it's not much, but it is something, so I have to point it out. But he's really the only one that behaves uniquely when faced with his death. All the other villains are basically the same. In the comic book, Eric doesn't actually run into any issues whatsoever. He comes back to life, he goes through, kills everybody, nobody can stop him or even really slow him down. In between each of the kills, we see him mourning and says some very beautiful poetry about grief and how he feels at that particular moment, and then moves on to the next person to kill. The only two emotions he shows throughout the entire story are sadness and anger, and the only actions he takes is self-mutilation, drug use, and murder. That's it. That's his whole character in a nutshell. There are a few things here and there in the story that do add a bit more to his character, but their value is reliant on looking at it in a symbolic way as opposed to literally. For instance, The Crow has two scenes with this little girl named Sherry, where if you look at those scenes literally, all it really tells you about the Crow is that he's caring and kind. If you look at it symbolically, it's his connection to humanity. You also have things like Eric rejecting any sort of happiness that comes into his life. For instance, there's a scene where his cat shows up and he starts smiling, looking at his cat, and he tells his cat to go away and kind of shoves her to the side, saying he doesn't want to be happy or smile right now. Eric purposely goes out of his way multiple times to make himself feel more miserable by reminding himself of his dead girlfriend. He wants to feel that pain and suffering and behaves in a way that causes that pain and suffering to him. And then you have the way he behaves when he's alone compared to the way he behaves when he's actually on his murder mission. When he's alone, he's constantly sad and crying and hurting himself and doing all this. But then when he's going on his murder sprees, he's almost numb. No one anyone could say can harm him. He doesn't seem angry or upset about anything. His character is basically showing the different sides of grief. The scenes where he's alone, he's in pain and tormenting himself. Whereas the scenes when he's doing his missions are empty and meaningless. So it's not like there's nothing here. There just isn't that much. Basically, that little bit that I just told you are the only real things I could say about his character. If I were to sit down and do a character analysis of him, I couldn't really say a whole lot. I can really just talk about how he relates to the author, because that's all he is. The villains also don't have much of a character. They're just pure evil for pure evil's sake, because that's how the author viewed the drunk driver that took his fiancée away from him. They're not given any sort of character or desire outside of just doing this evil thing. The story doesn't have things that you would expect in pretty much any other story, like a conflict or any sort of challenge challenge for our hero to overcome, because he's not just a protagonist in a story that has to overcome a challenge. He's a symbolic representation of grief. And what the author was trying to say about his grief is it can't be stopped, it can't be slowed down, it just has to be allowed to run its course until it's eventually done. The character, in quotations, of Eric is written to be this hostile, destructive, and self-destructive force of violence and hatred, because that's how the author felt while writing the story. Things that you would expect to be explained in the story, like how Eric came back to life, how his powers work, who brought him back to life, how does he know all these skills that he has when he goes after these people, why does he speak in such a poetic way, where did he get the talent to create such beautiful poetry? None of it's explained. He's not a character, he's just a stand-in for the author's own grief. Now, if you read this story knowing this going in, it's an interesting sort of experiment, right? You're seeing the things that were going through the mind of the author while he was writing this story, and it's a very sad and interesting read. However, as a story on its own without knowing all that extra context, it's a very basic by-the-numbers revenge story about a guy who speaks in very interesting and flowery language, who just easily goes through the entire story without ever coming upon any sort of challenge. And look, I get it. The story is not necessarily a revenge story. That's not really the point. The point is an exploration of grief. I get it. I do. But in this exploration of grief, they wrote pretty bad characters. And this might just be a me thing. I'm okay with your story being a stand-in for certain types of metaphors. That's fine. But you can't forget to write a proper story while you're doing that. I make character analysis for a reason. I like characters. I like well-written, three-dimensional characters with beliefs, goals, ideas, opinions. This is interesting. Eric doesn't have any of that. He's just a very sad, angry guy who speaks in flowery language that is admittedly very poignant. Like, every line he says is poetry. And the comic is almost worth reading just for the very poetic things that he says. I think that's one of the reasons this comic is so well remembered, is because of just the way he speaks. The writer of the story has to have a background in poetry or something, because some of the lines that Eric says are just downright beautiful. So while I do believe the comic succeeds in its exploration of grief, it kind of fails at making a well-rounded story. And I personally just wish that it was written in a way that could have done both. I mean, damn, it's not like there aren't a ton of stories that are about grief and also have well-written characters. God of War, the Greek version, not the fucking Norse version. I Kill Giants is a comic book about a kid who's grieving over his sick mother. Fucking Pixar's Up. You can go on. There's a ton of stories like this out there. Now, with all the shit that I'm giving this story, do I think that you shouldn't read it? No, I think you should. It's not bad. You just need to go in being aware of what it is. And I personally have a hard time enjoying stories without well-rounded characters. But I'm not going to dissuade someone into reading it if it might mean something very profound to them, because it does have interesting things to say. It's an interesting look at how this particular man felt during the grieving process of an actual real-life tragedy. You might not care that much that the characters aren't particularly well written. And the very poignant things that Eric says about grief and loss might really resonate with you as a reader. I personally found it interesting, but not really something I would want to read again. You might differ. So on to the movie. As I said before, the basic story of both the comic and the movie are essentially identical. It's really just the details that they changed. But while that core story remains the same, there are certain details that they change that fundamentally change the story as a whole. And I don't really know what way to describe it other than to say that they kind of Hollywoodified the comic. The comic is a very non-traditionally told story. As I've said before, the characters aren't really characters, the villains don't really matter, the revenge plot itself doesn't really matter. It's all just a stand-in for these sort of middle sections where they talk about grief and loss. There's no real challenge for the main character to overcome, and it sort of just ends without any really solid resolution or epilogue or anything like that. The movie changes all of this. Eric Draven, given the last name Draven in the movie, actually is a character. He's given more to do than just be a stand-in for grief. He has human connections with other people, as well as thoughts, feelings, and a personality that he just straight up didn't have in the comic. They give explanation for things that the comic didn't feel the need to give an explanation for, like how he came back from the dead, why he speaks in such poetic language, why the villains attacked him and his girlfriend. There's an actual story built around the actions that the character takes. Eric was given a history in the movie that explains a lot of his behavior. In the comic, we don't know what he was before he died. There's really no explanation as to how he has the skills that he has. The movie makes him a rock star and songwriter, so the more poetic language that he uses throughout are actually straight up lyrics to his songs. They make it clear that this is the way his mind works, and this is how he processes thoughts in this very poetic way. Although not much, Shelly the girlfriend is given a bit more of a personality. Her death actually has a reason in the movie. She was fighting for tenants' rights and standing up against Top Dollar, who owned the building that her and Eric lived in. Top Dollar being a mob boss and the villain of the movie. The attack in the comic just seemed random, and we don't actually know why it happened. Top Dollar as a whole is a completely different character. In the comic, he was just like a regular goon who worked for T-Bird, but in the movie, they they actually make him above T-Bird and give him this whole mob organization thing that he has. And they also give him an interest in the occult, which gives him a weapon that he can use against the Crow. So now Eric Draven in the movie actually has conflict, something that he has to overcome, that he can't just easily wipe out. The villains of the movie are way improved from the comic book. While none of them have a whole lot of character necessarily, like we don't know anything about them, they don't have desires and goals of their own or anything like that. We don't get backstories for anybody. The way they're written and the way each actor plays the role gives them all a unique personality that's just very entertaining to watch on screen. T-Bird, Top Dollar, and the retarded one being standouts.
There ain't no coming back. This is the really real world. There ain't no coming back. We killed your dad. There ain't no coming back. Ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back.
All these little changes in the movie fill in all of these gaps that I thought were missing in the original comic. Now, admittedly, they did do this by lessening the metaphorical purpose of the comic, which some people might not like, but a lot of that metaphor is still there, and I think it was worth the trade-off to actually have characters in a story that you can get behind and give a shit about. But the movie does actually introduce a couple of its own problems. For one, I think they try to make the plot a little too complex. In the comic, it's a very basic revenge story. He goes out and kills a bunch of people, and that's it. There is no greater plan there. In the movie, they add this whole Devil's Night thing, where once a year during Halloween, Top Dollar sends all of his goons out to just randomly burn down different buildings, and apparently they do this to earn money. And this is a really big plot point in the movie that has nothing to do with anything. Like, I don't even know why it's there. For one, we don't really understand how Top Dollar is making money by burning down buildings, and two, it doesn't really feed into the revenge plot at all. You can essentially remove the whole Devil's Night plot point from the movie and it wouldn't change anything. It just adds an unnecessary confusing layer to the story that I don't think needs to be there. I know the film section of this video is pretty short, but that's because most of what I had to say about the film I already said about the comic. You could just take that and bring it in here. But a lot of the bad stuff I had to say about the comic, I can't say about the film. It really is a solid adaptation of the comic that has everything in that I think it needs to have in order to be a good adaptation, while adding just enough of its own stuff to make it a better story overall. The only real negative I have to say about the adaptation aspect of the story is the point of it all. The comic is very clearly a story written by a guy who has not yet gotten past the grief that he's going through. By the end of the story, it feels very empty and meaningless. The movie has a much more Hollywood, light-hearted ending to it. Eric actually works his way through his grief and even goes and meets Shelley back in the afterlife. This doesn't happen in the comic. There is no happy ending. And this is something that Hollywood does a lot. Now, it's not necessarily a better or worse ending either way, but if you're someone who judges adaptations by taking the soul of the original property and bringing it up in a different form, it sort of fails because its soul has a completely different purpose for existing. The point it's trying to make is not the same. So at the end of all this, which is better, the Crow comic or the movie? No surprise here, the movie is significantly better than the comic in my personal opinion. All the good stuff that I really enjoy in the comic was properly ported over into the movie, and the stuff that I didn't like was fixed. And honestly, I don't have that many negatives to say about the movie. It's a solid film, and its existence completely shits on the idea that adaptations are always worse than the source material. That's just not true here. Anyway, that's gonna be all from me. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and click that little bell icon. And I've been getting quite a few people telling me that they're not getting notifications for my videos. If you want notifications of my videos, you have to click on the bell icon. And always remember, y'all be safe out there, you hear?